Thank you for being here tonight. I'm Amelia Layden. I'm the Associate Curator here at the Haggerty. And we're delighted to have Tom Knechtel here with us in town from Los Angeles. We are very fortunate to have one of Tom's paintings in our permanent collection. It's this painting right here, which is also on view in the gallery downstairs as part of the exhibition Aberrance and Artifice, the Norton Collection. And for those of you not familiar with the Norton Collection, it's one of our highlights, I would say, and Tom may be able to speak to this in greater detail. I don't know if you plan on covering this in your lecture, but in the early 2000s, contemporary art collectors Eileen and Peter Norton began to subdivide nearly 1,000 works of art from their collection into groupings organized by theme and subject matter. So these mini collections were then donated to museums across the country to increase appreciation for contemporary art and to strengthen the permanent collection holdings of the recipient institutions. So this was a really important gift for the Haggerty Museum here. We received 28 paintings, drawings, photographs, and sculptures, which have not been on view as a group since that initial gift. So that's kind of why we're all here tonight, to see that collection in its entirety. This exhibition and the speaking program were made possible thanks to funding from the Wisconsin Arts Board, the state of Wisconsin, and the National Endowment for the Arts. I'd like to thank our generous sponsors, and then of course the Haggerty staff for all of their hard work setting the exhibition and the speaking arrangements up. And before Tom begins, I'll tell you a little bit more about him. He earned his BFA and MFA from the California Institute of the Arts in Valencia, California. He's currently a faculty member in the Fine Art Department and interim chair of the Fine Art Department of the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, California. In 2002, he had a 25-year retrospective exhibition titled On Wanting to Grow Horns, which opened at the Weatherspoon Art Gallery in North Carolina before traveling to the Ben Maltz Gallery at Otis College of Art and Design, the Contemporary Art Museum, Honolulu, Hawaii, and the Henry Art Gallery in Seattle, Washington. His work is represented in many prominent collections, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles, the Hammer Museum Los Angeles, and the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco, and the Haggerty. So please join me in welcoming Tom Knechtel to the podium.
Thank you all for coming. What I thought I would do is talk a little bit about the painting that's here at the Haggerty and the sort of the way it came into being and the context it came out of. And then what I'd like to do is talk about some of the other artists in LA from the same period that that painting came out of, and those artists were part of my context. And two of them are in this show, Tom Woodle and Tim Ebner. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about their work. And if you have any questions, I mean, this is such a nice, intimate group. If you have any questions, just put your hand up and let's talk. So this is a painting called Lessons in the Theater, Ejaculations. It's ejaculations in both the sort of sexual sense and ejaculations in the sense of people talking, because as we'll see when I show you some close-ups, there's lots of characters who are speaking in it. It's a wooden panel. I'll talk a little bit more about how it's made, but it's a wooden panel. It's about 5 feet tall, and it has this small wooden sign. When I make paintings, one thing I think is important to talk about at the outset is I don't plan the paintings out ahead of time. For me, meaning is more interesting when it's cumulative. I always think of meaning as like a snowball that's rolling down a hill. That it's it starts out small, and as the painting goes on, it gathers more and more meanings to it. And I'm really interested in meaning also being not unified, but contradictory. I think meaning's richer when things in a work of art are contradicting themselves, they're working against each other. There's all kinds of friction springing up from how that works. And so I'm interested in paintings that speak with instead of speaking with a single voice, they speak with lots of voices. And at the time that this painting was made, which is I think 91 or 92, I was very interested in a very collage-like approach where there's lots of things being pulled in from different places. Part of what informed this painting, and a lot of, excuse me, a lot of my work, is a love of theater. And that's part of why it had the title it did. This is a toy theater from England from the early 19th century. And somebody gave me a reproduction of one of these when I was about 14. And I loved everything about it. I loved planning out the plays. I loved figuring out what would happen. I didn't actually love performing. I just loved the image of it and making things in it. And that kind of template of how theater works really impressed itself on me. And theater went on to become a kind of another art form that I could think through. Oftentimes I find there are other art forms like literature or theater where I find it useful to think about what happens in there and then take it back to my own work. One of the people who helped me the most with this was a good friend of mine, Beatrice Manley. And Beatrice was a wonderful actress. She was a teacher at Cal Arts when I was there, and she taught a lot of the people who I was close to, people like Paul Rubens, Winston Tong, who was a great puppeteer. And Beatrice and I would go out to theater, and then we'd have these conversations about why things worked or didn't work, why something felt real or why something felt forced or fake. And when I did these two paintings, calling them lessons in the theater, I was thinking very much about the conversations that Bea and I were having, where I was kind of learning all the stuff about theater that I wished I'd learned earlier, not because I wanted to be in theater, but just because I wanted to think through it. This is, Dick, do you know what this is from?
Yes, from Calvino.
Okay. Dick Blau, who's a wonderful photographer here in Milwaukee, is Bea's son. And Bea was very, very adventurous. She also once told me what I thought was one of the best pieces of advice about theater, which actually came from Dick and his wife, Jane Gallup. She told me that they had told their son, Max, when he was 4 years old and he was making his first public appearance in a play, that the basic instructions were face the audience, talk loud, and don't hold your penis. And I feel those are words to live by. So the other thing that had a tremendous impact on my work and thinking was in 1984 there was the Olympic Arts Festival in LA as part of the Olympic Games, and it was just this astonishing summer where the Royal Shakespeare Company came, Ariane Mnouchkine brought her Théâtre du Soleil from Paris, and Giorgio Strehler brought the Piccolo Teatro from Milan, and they all did Shakespeare. And Giorgio Strehler's group did The Tempest, which is on the left, in this just amazing production that was so magical, so bare bones and so magical at the same time. And Ariane Mnouchkine was, with the Théâtre du Soleil, was doing Shakespeare sort of run through a filter of kabuki theater from Japan and Kathakali theater from India. And this kind of interest in artificial theater, highly artificial forms of theater, embedded itself so completely in me in '84 that when in '90, about the time I did the painting that's in the other room, I received my first large grant. It was a grant from the Getty, from the California Community Foundation, and I used the grant to go to Japan and India to see the theaters that had informed Mnouchkine's work. But that work was very much filtering into what I was doing in the painting. So, as I said, meaning is not constructed ahead of time. But what happens is, as the painting goes on, paintings often take a long time. The paintings have often taken as long as a year sometimes to finish, because I will not plan it, I paint something, I double back, I paint out, I change things. And so meaning sort of unveils itself as I go through the painting. When I start the paintings, I've learned to start with as little as I possibly can. And in this case, all I started was with the idea that there was a theater kind of shoved into the side of this semi-tondo, as if it was being shoved into the world. But as the painting went on over the months, I began to realize that part of really what I was painting about was a kind of key dilemma of my life, which is how does a gay boy who is close to his heterosexual parents develop his fantasy life and his sense of what lies ahead? There's a photo I want to show you in a little bit that relates to that. So in the painting, there's a unicorn in the basement, or as a friend of mine at one point in the process of the painting characterized it, a unicorn rhinoceros plow horse porn star who's in the basement watching films of men wrestling, and then he's connected, the projector is powered by a cord that runs up to the griffin who's dancing up on the stage. And part of what fascinates me in making a painting is the idea of going from something that you have to stand across the room to look at, to something that keeps saying to the viewer, get over here, get over here, get over here, get closer, get closer, get closer. So that, especially in the time I was doing these paintings, I was really fascinated with getting some part of the painting that was as miniature as I could get it. So this is what's passing through the penis of the unicorn. All of this kind of landscape, and there's a pair of lovers embracing, there's a man fishing in a boat, all this stuff happening. This is the photo I was thinking of. This is my favorite photo of my dad and I. And as I said, I think fantasy has always been very, very important to me, and fantasy has been a key topic of my work, not so much just creating fantasy, but also asking, how does fantasy function? Why do we need fantasy? What purposes, in terms of escaping, does it serve for us? And trying to figure out in this, when I was doing these paintings, about if you're raised by two people who are heterosexual, but all of your structure inside in terms of how you're fantasizing is about a gay relationship or gay relationships, how do you start gluing those things together when you're a child? What sort of images sort of lock onto each other and then start to inform kind of your own mythology, for lack of a better word? And I still am very close to my folks. And so there's this kind of mer family in the lower right of the painting, a merman whose penis is blowing a trumpet, and then this mermaid. And all of these things were sort of pulled from all over the place. It was a very, very collage-like approach. For instance, the mermaid there is based on a figure in a Dosa painting that's at the Getty Museum. But what's interesting for me as time has gone by is when the paintings are over, a lot of times I can go through and still remember where everything came from. But now, many times, a lot of the sources have just sort of melted away, and all that's left is the painting. There's this baby wearing a crown. He's being sort of carried up to the surface of the water by his mother. There's all of this blowing of trumpets, and then there are these characters who are, oops, let me go back, who are standing at the edge of the theater looking down into the ocean where all this ruckus is taking place, and the characters are all talking. They're saying different things. This character, who's based on Zero Mostel, is saying a line from Crazy Cat, "My, how agitated the ocean is today." And there's other characters who are quoting lines from Jacobean drama. There's lines from Ronald Furbank. There's lines from a Hollywood movie called Married to the Mob. All this stuff kind of collaged together. And the other thing that was affecting this period of the work was my fascination with Mannerism, with the painting that was going on in Europe right after the Renaissance, when painters had sort of explored that whole language of representation as completely as they could. And then the question was, okay, well, what do you do next? Now that you can figure out how to paint something accurately and beautifully, where do you go? And where you start going is towards more extreme states and more artificial states. So a painting like this Pontormo painting, which has, all of these sort of writhing figures, and this marvelous figure here, which appears to be a cherub imitating Marilyn Monroe, who won't be on the scene for several hundred years yet, there are these kind of astonishing moments that happen in Mannerism, where it's a language that's very invested in the artificial, and the artificial was really fascinating to me. The idea that when something is really artificial, as a viewer, you kind of have to participate with the artist in making it happen. Because they're not trying to fool you. They're not trying to tell you something isn't what it is. They're saying it's fake, and you have to buy in. And then when you buy in, that brings in another whole level of how the meaning works. These are some of the other things that got collaged in. There's a Jacques Callot dwarf, an etching, and then this is Zero Mostel on the right, who I adore. This is from a book he did of various villains. And all of the, and you can see, here's the Callot dwarf, and here's Mostel. And then there are these sort of deformed cherubs flying up in the air who are missing various limbs. There were two people who were very involved with the making of this painting who were really key to what happened in it. And one of them is a wonderful jeweler named Jim Matthews. And at the show I had before the show that this was part of, I was at the opening, and this man came up and introduced himself and asked if we could go out to lunch and talk about the idea of me designing jewelry for Van Cleef and Arpels. And he was the director at the time of design for Van Cleef and Arpels. And he's a wonderful, courtly guy from Texas, very, very funny. Has a very dark sense of humor. He has an extensive collection of 19th century graveyard photos and photos of people in their coffins. And Jim took me out to lunch, and we talked about the idea of jewelry. And I don't wear jewelry except for my wedding ring. What I ended up doing was talking him into doing something with me, because I'd always wanted to have a painting where there was a signboard on the outside of the painting, like the ones you see in Europe, where there are these elaborate kind of, Bavarian signboards that advertise something that's inside the shop. I wanted signboards that would advertise what was in the painting. And Jim got so completely on board with this that he designed these exquisite signs. I mean, the first thing I have to tell you I did when I got here is I raced into the other room to see if the sign was still intact, because they're so delicate that I can't quite believe they're still around. This one is, as you'll see, it's only about, this big. And I did a drawing for it, and then Jim developed this whole fantasy where two figures that kind of fit into the sign, what's going on in the painting, are interacting. There's a mermaid, and then this kind of top-hatted figure like the Zero Mostel character, and they hold up a sign that shows these two men wrestling, which then rhymes with what the rhino is watching in the basement. And the other person who helped with this painting has to do with the little niche. There's this little tiny niche in the, I have a close-up of it, that's built into the painting. And we had in LA for years a wonderful, wonderful craftsman named Lucius Hudson, who built panels for a lot of us who are artists and painters. And Lucius was amazing. It got so that it was almost this kind of game of designing something. I would design these panels, not with any idea of what would go on them. I just think, what's the weirdest thing I could come up with that Lucius could make? And like, okay, a little tiny, 1.5-inch niche. Let's see if Lucius can do that. And he would do them exquisitely, beautifully. And so it sort of unleashed for a period of time a way that I could approach my paintings as if they were like toys, as if they were like automatons or really sort of astonishing Fabergé objects. This niche, when you see it in the next room, if you look down onto the niche, you'll see there's two wedding rings that are laying on the shelf, and they have a ribbon passing through them. And to be honest, I can't remember what's on the ribbon now. It says the title of the painting. It says Lessons in the Theater, a Comedy. This is Lucius. This is from his logo. Lucius also had a wonderful sense of humor like Jim. Jim is still with us, Lucius is not. And this is the other painting that was in this same group. This is called Lessons in the Theater, Bachelorhood. I'm not going to go through the whole painting, but I wanted to show this one. In this one, the theater sort of is, I thought of the painting as if it was the ground plan for a church, with the nave and the transept, and the paint with the theater kind of as the crossing part. And when I designed this, let me go back actually, when Lucius brought it to my studio, there was this beautiful wooden shape with this door cut out at the bottom and a whole thing behind the door so that there was something I could paint on in the back. And then over here on this side was this astonishing Baroque kind of shape, and that kind of like this, all carved out of wood all carved out of wood, really beautifully with sides and everything. And I said, Lucius, what is this? That's not in the drawing. And he said, oh, yes, it is. And he pulled out the drawing, and I had drawn, like, from one part to the painting to another part. I go, well, okay, from here to here is 5 inches. From here to here is 15 inches. And he had duplicated part of it. So there was this astonishing, and I've always regretted that I cut it off. And for this painting, Jim designed a really astonishing sign, which is carved, all the leaf parts are carved out of boxwood, which is explained to me as the wood that was used a lot for medieval sculpture, but is an extinct wood now. And so there's only small amounts of it that are still being used. And then the bells are about 1/8 of an inch tall, each one of them, and they all ring. Not very loud, but they ring. This piece is in LA in the collection of somebody who collects automatons. I was thrilled that was where it ended up. And the signboard in that case, this painting works very differently. This painting, I mean, it still has some of the stuff going on about parsing through one's childhood, and the ribbon, there's a ribbon flying through this thunderstorm at the top of the painting, and the ribbon has the birth dates of my parents and all of my grandparents on it. And then the side wings of the theater kind of break down into sort of masculine imagery, feminine imagery, and then there's this kind of, all of this leading down to this giant sort of heart fountain that stopped. And it was really sort of me thinking about, you know, at the time I was single, and I'd been single for a very long time, and I was thinking, well, maybe this is sort of where all this mythology comes to rest, is in a state of bachelorhood. And so the signboard at the bottom has a hedgehog, you know, sort of all curled up with his prickles facing out, and on a ribbon written around him is Noli me tangere, which is what Christ says to Mary in the garden after he's resurrected, which means don't touch me. I wanted to show you just a few of the drawings. Drawings have always, paintings and drawings have sort of moved on separate but parallel tracks for me in the course of my work, where the paintings would be sort of large and sprawling, and I always thought of them as kind of like operas or spectacles. The drawings instead tended to be, and still tend to be, more focused, more singular, more just one thing at a time. I often think of the drawings as if I'm grabbing something and pulling it up close so I can see it really carefully. And also, the drawings, when I was doing these paintings, it's still relatively new to oil painting. I'd only been oil painting for about maybe less than 10 years. Up until then, all of my work was in watercolor and gouache. And so oil paint really freed me up to feel like I could try any language at all. The oil paint seemed almost uncontrollable. And my drawing sort of exploded, because suddenly, instead of drawing with just pencil, which is the way I did before, I drew with pastel, I drew with silver point, I drew with ink. I was drawing with all these different mediums and trying to see what they could do for me. So this, for instance, is a silver point, going back to the image of the griffin from the first painting. And this one is a pastel on paper. This is called Coccodrillo. Coccodrillo is a character from the Commedia dell'arte. He's kind of a braggart. It's based on Tom Jenkins, who was an early 19th century, early 20th century American wrestler. I showed this to a friend. I remember when I was working on this, a friend of mine came in the studio, and he said, oh, that's what all the guys at the gym do. They put their arms under their biceps to push them up. And this one's called Bachelorhood. So what I would like to do, this is backwards. So what's amazing is I've been working on this lecture for, you know, the last couple weeks off and on, and I had seen this image. Tom Woodle, who's painting this, had sent it to me this way, and it was on the Haggerty's website going in the other direction, and now I can stand here, look at it, and look in the other room and see it's in the wrong way. What I'd like to do is to talk to you about 4 painters in LA, 4 different artists, not just painters. And LA is a very, very interesting community. It is very diverse. It's getting steadily more and more diverse with all the art schools that we have there. It's a very permissive place to work. Even though I think LA in many ways now is the production center for art in the United States, but it's still not the marketing center. And in a way, and it's not the center of publishing in terms of like the art magazines and so forth. And what that's created is a sort of situation where there's an enormous amount of activity, but there's not the kind of maybe weight of history or of watching to see what other people's careers are doing. And so the community is remarkably generous. It's a very permissive community, a very supportive community. Artists talk a lot about each other's work. They talk to each other. They're very generous with talking to dealers and collectors and curators about each other's work. And I think that's very much a part of the atmosphere around what happened in my own work. Tom is an amazing artist. Tom has a positively messianic sense of what the artist's identity is. He really has the sense that craft carries conviction. And this is a photo of Tom in his studio. And this is a portrait of Tom by Don Bacardi, who's an artist who's been chronicling the LA community now for years. And this is actually a sculpture of Tom from Mindy Alper's show that recently was in LA. It's a very startling sculpture. It's about, the bust part is about this high, and it's larger than life and extraordinarily vivid and made out of chicken wire and paper mache. With none of the paper mache being painted or colored. She used the Wall Street Journal because she said it had the best quality paper, and she would just look for colors that would rhyme with the color she wanted to put into the bust. Tom's work, one of the things I realized as I was putting this talk together that's interesting is one of the things that happens in LA with a lot of artists, not all, but a lot of them, is that there is a sense that artists feel the need to keep moving their work forward and changing their work. Instead of finding a signature style, they will explore in one direction and then all of a sudden turn 90 degrees and start exploring in another direction. So for instance, Tom's work that he was most famous for when he was young were these very, very beautiful, enormous pieces painted on paper, which then were punched over and over again with like a hole punch until the whole thing was like this shimmering, delicate-looking fabric, all abstract, sort of a sense somewhere between a kind of constructionist approach and like diagrams of, mandalas. But then Tom had a point in his work where he really felt that he needed to return to a kind of representation. He worked for about a year on this painting, which is called The Birth of Jan van Eyck, in which Robert Rowan, who was a collector in LA, is seen as this kind of multi-armed Shiva-like figure in the middle of this wonderful landscape of LA that's kind of collaged together from several different points of view, getting in very close to something, pulling back from something. And so, let me go back a little bit. So during the time that Tom did the painting that's here at the Haggerty and the one that's to the left of it in the next room, Tom was really engrossed in a sense that oil paint gave you a kind of window into representation that was about reverence for the world, pulling the viewer into that reverence, really sort of casting off cynicism and irony. And in fact, when he did this painting, I called him at one point and asked him, to tell me a little bit about this. I remember this painting from the original show it was in, and he said that for him, that it was a period when he was reading a biography of Freud, and he was thinking about Freud's struggle to define himself and how almost bloody that seemed to him, and that he was redefining his own work. This is when he was sort of rethinking this whole approach from abstraction into figuration again. And the wildebeest for him was a sacrifice and made in the name of the search of the artist for himself and the animal standing in for the artist, and the idea that you needed to sacrifice everything in the name of finding your creative self, and that it was a painting he really felt he made for other artists, that he made for other artists to react to and to think about. He's also one of the orneriest people in LA. I adore Tom. I really love Tom, and he's just so ornery. And I took a group of students to his studio. I don't think Richard Galling, I don't think you were were you part of the group that went to Tom's studio? We went into Tom's studio, and there was a big table, and it was completely cleaned except for 4 sharpened pencils that were in the middle of the table, and Tom was sitting on the other side of the table from the students coming in, not saying anything, just kind of glowering at them. And so everybody filed in, and I introduced Tom, and I said, "Oh, take it away, Tom." And there's this kind of ominous silence, and then Tom said, "I pity you." And I thought, ooh, we're off and running. And Tom, he really, I think it comes out of that messianic sense of the mission of art. He really believes that a work of art is crucial. Though Tom has a very good sense of humor, in the work is about a sense of mission of what you're conveying. And this is what Tom is working on now. There are these exquisite paintings of roses. I mean, these are almost impossible to get across in slides, because what happens is when you're up close, the roses are covered with these patterns and details. So something like this, the rose maybe is only this big, but when you're looking at it up close, it's just covered with these patterns and details. And they're based on the Lotus Sutra. I can't take it further than that because I don't understand it exactly, but they're based in Tom's explorations of the Lotus Sutra. And they're also done, in this case, some of them are on canvas, but in this case, this is on tissue paper. The next artist I wanted to talk about is Karen Carson. Karen and Tom come from roughly the same generation, and Karen has been around LA for years. This shot here I particularly wanted to put in because this is something that seems to me very emblematic of LA. This is a group called Art Division that was started by another artist, Dan McCleary. And Dan had his studio down by MacArthur Park, where there's a lot of gang activity, a lot of Latino families are down there. And Dan became very drawn into the idea that there were people who would stop by and look at what he was doing in his studio, and again, kids from the neighborhood would get to know him and talk to him. And he became very involved with the idea that there weren't a lot of options for these kids. They weren't getting access to art education. They were never going to end up going to a school like Art Center necessarily. They didn't have even access to art materials. And Dan began kind of heroically and single-handedly organizing this thing that would bring all these artists and collectors and people together to bring art education to these kids. And it's been amazing to watch. And artists have all been trooping down there. They go down and they talk to the kids. They spend days teaching. They've been giving all the library that you see in the back is all donated from artists and collectors giving books out of their libraries to the kids. And this is Karen in the red sweatshirt teaching at Art Division. This is a painting of Karen by Don Bacardi, another one of his portraits that chronicle the LA art scene. And Karen also is somebody who, in Karen's work, it's sort of even more amazing. Tom kind of made a shift from abstraction to figuration. In Karen's case, she almost show to show to show changes how her work works in a way that I have really deep admiration for. It's like she goes into the studio, she does not think, well, this was successful in my last show, so I'm going to do more of that. She goes into her studio and she starts all over again from scratch, practically every time, rethinking what her work's about. When I first knew her work, she was doing abstract paintings like this one. They were kind of based on a kind of a jagged, jazzy sort of cubism, oftentimes with other things like mirrors or picture molding thrown into the painting. But steadily, this sense of humor that she has in her work has come through. This was a show where she painted on globes. I think I have a close-up of one of them. Yeah, she took globes and she painted on all of them. And then they were suspended throughout the gallery, and all over the walls were drawings of angels sort of grabbing each other, throwing each other away, coupling, moving around. So you were sort of in this cosmos looking at these paintings that surrounded you. And the paintings ranged from abstractions over the globes to logos to kinds of almost tattoo-like images. This is from a whole series of banners that she did in a show that was about 3 years ago. They're faces that sort of become illustrations of different emotional states, but the faces are so abstracted that they sort of straddle between abstraction and figuration. And I love how Karen is really interested in the aesthetics of vulgarity and how vulgarity and humor can jar you and free you up from expectations. So she'll do things like the way that she letters into this painting is typical of that kind of throwing you a curveball. And I think, oh, no, I don't have another one. Right now she's working on these paintings in her studio that are just astonishing. They're huge paintings of tractors that are about 12 feet tall. And they're beautiful. I told you they're the most butch paintings I've seen in ages. They're really, really astonishing paintings. And that's part of what I really value about Karen, and in fact, a lot of my colleagues in LA, is that sense that when you go into somebody's studio, a lot of times with a lot of these artists, you don't know what you're going to see. And with Karen, it's especially so. You really have no clue what's going to happen in the next show. This is a wonderful artist, Robin Mitchell. And Robin is the anomaly in this group, and that Robin is somebody who's made an early commitment to abstraction, and she's held to it through her whole life. She's explored it in all sorts of ways that are really fascinating and have taken her really deep into thinking about how abstraction works through other traditions, through other decorative traditions, through other kinds of meaning, but she's really held to that. And this was a beautiful sculpture that's just about exactly contemporaneous with the painting in the next room. It's very typical. A lot of Robin's work feels like it comes out of a kind of exploration of tantric imagery or of Tibetan paintings. This has a kind of sense almost as if it's like a representation of a spine, the energy of a spine in a way. And Robin, a few years ago, actually now it's probably more like 8 years ago now, made a kind of interesting breakthrough that I had not seen anyone else make. This is actually not quite one of her paintings. What it is it's a computer scan where she took one of her paintings, and she was really fascinated with the computer. Her work is very much handmade, and yet she's an incredible computer maven. She just knows her way. She loves computers. She's really gotten so she knows her way around. Everybody I know when their computer breaks down calls Robin. And so she fed one of her paintings into a computer, scanned it, flipped it over, turned it sideways, made a kind of a Rorschach blot out of it, printed it out, looked at it, and then thought, well, this is interesting. Now what happens if I actually start painting these by hand? And she began making these just rivetingly beautiful abstract paintings where there are these kind of shimmering curtains of mark making, where they're symmetrical, but they're just enough handmade that, as your eye starts to get teased into this game of looking from side to side and checking to see if you really are seeing that they're as symmetrical as they seem, you realize there's slight variations, and they again seem to me to tie back to the kind of way that in Tibetan Thangka painting, there'll be an image that's ravishingly beautiful, and at the same time it has a kind of a grandeur that's about symmetry and formal order. And they're astonishing paintings, and they're the only, oftentimes with my students I've talked about this idea that I'm waiting to see when a generation that's been raised on computers comes to the language of painting and brings us something in the language of painting that comes out of computers that we haven't seen before, other than a mimicking of how computers look. And it seems to me that Robin is one of the few painters I've seen who's really come up with something that comes out of the language of computers and goes into painting with another kind of approach. And this is from a show this is actually a piece that's going to be in a show in LA. I think it opens in 2 weeks, actually. There's an incredible exuberance to Robin's language that I really love. And then this is Tim Ebner. And Tim Ebner is the person who did the painting that's right over here, that the Haggerty owns. And this is a sculpture. Actually, Tim shows at Rosamund Felsen. And Rosamund Felsen, one of the artists in the gallery is Grant Mudford. And Grant has been steadily photographing everyone who shows at the gallery for every show, and doing a portrait of them, which ends up becoming another whole chronicle of LA art. And this is from his last show. Tim had created this flock of metal fish. Tim is a really interesting case of what I'm talking about with reinvention. Tim had the thing happen to him that's a kind of a blessing and a curse for a young artist. When he was a very young artist, he was just coming out of grad school in CalArts, he was producing these kinds of resin paintings that were things that seem to dovetail with so many things about an interest in reinvestigating minimalism, about the history of LA art that was called finish fetish, where people were doing, like Billy Al Bengston, people doing things that were or Craig Kaufman, people exploring things with resin. Tim seemed like a young artist who was coming in and building on that, and his work just went off like a rocket in terms of the reaction of the art world. He sold everything. I remember Count Panza from Milan came in and bought, 2 shows, the entire shows. It was hugely successful. And then after about maybe, I don't know, 7 or 8 years of that, he decided he had to reinvent himself. And he went through this thing that I just think was extraordinary, where he was showing, at that time, he was showing with Rosamund Felsen. Let me see if I've actually, let me skip to this. This is a picture of Rosamund at one of Tim's shows. Artists reinventing themselves are not dependent on dealers, but I have to say it's really moving when you have a dealer like Rosamund who really stands behind her artists. And Rosamund really has seen a lot of artists through a lot of wild turns in their studio life, and she has always been incredibly supportive. She has never said no to an artist in terms of what they show. I think the only time she said no was an artist who wanted to show his collection of pot holders. That was where she drew the line. But the rest of the time, she's always supported artists, the freedom that artists need to claim. She's never said to artists, you can't, I can't sell that, why would I show that? And I think what it gave Tim was this incredible kind of courage, where for a period of time, Tim did a show almost every year. And I remember that a lot of us would troop into these shows and we'd look at these paintings he was doing and we'd just go, oh my God, what happened? It's like he lost his mind. He was doing these kind of strange cartoony ink drawings. He was piling up all this stuff into the canvas. It was an incredible thing in retrospect to watch an artist paint his way out of a dilemma. He knew that this was something that he had done, he had explored it, it was over. And other artists in LA have talked about that. Monique Prieto is a wonderful young artist, not so young now, but an artist. It also had the same thing happen to her, and she talked once about how she was going to an opening of hers in Venice, Italy, and all her work was selling. She had multiple dealers dealing with her work. She was on her way to the opening and with her family, and she suddenly realized that the work was vacant, that all the meaning had run out of the work, and that she was the only one who knew it, and that she had to be responsible to that. And in her case, she took a year off and didn't let anybody see what she was doing and just kind of worked and worked and worked until she found a new direction. In Tim's case, he did it all in public. He sort of painted for it was probably about 5 years of these shows that were so erratic. And then right about the time of the Haggerty painting in '91 is really when he began to suddenly catch his stride. And he was doing these astonishing paintings that were kind of taking animals and putting them into allegorical situations, except you could never really flatten them out to just an allegory. Never say it's a symbolic painting. They felt more like they were kind of carnivalesque paintings. I asked him about this painting, and he said that at the time he was letting images just flow out of the painting for the first time, and that it was so exciting that he could see what had been repressed in his practice for so long. He says there was a lot of editing during the painting process, but that kept building up the texture, so that the longer it took to get to the image, the more I had to struggle with the ground, which would be rough and unpredictable. This struggle between image and paint ultimately kept my imagination in check with what was meaningful to paint, which I think is really an interesting way to think about it. In other words, he's kind of making a situation where he's giving himself permission to paint anything, and at the same time, the ground of the painting is getting harder and harder to manipulate as he keeps building it up, so he has to keep finding a way to make the painting work as a painting. And then this is the finished version of the fish that he did. I think that's more than any, if I had to characterize art in LA and what goes on there, I think that this kind of freedom to claim an identity that changes around and shifts is something that's a very key part of LA. I think about artists like Richard Hawkins, who also is somebody who works on several bodies of work simultaneously, none of which necessarily look like each other. And I think that kind of sense that you can go anywhere and do anything with it is part of what the collection that Peter Norton put together really illustrates, is the sense of that freedom that artists should claim and that you should have for yourself. The pressures of the marketplace or the pressures of your own expectations sometimes can be ones that start to corral your decisions, even if you don't think you're doing that. And I've a lot of admiration for these artists who really have claimed the right to rethink their work and claimed the right to find something really surprising to themselves. And the result is something surprising to me also. So thank you. Do you have any questions? Any comments? Well, thank you very much for coming.